Hello, my name is Artur Markowski. I'm senior historian at the Polin Museum of the History of Polish Jews, and also I am assistant professor at the Institute of History, University of Warsaw. It is my great pleasure to see you here at the Polin Museum. Our conference, November Hopes, Jews and the Independence of Poland 1918, is organized by Polin Museum of the History of Polish Jews and the Institute of History, University of Warsaw. And it's sponsored by Global Education Outreach Program, Ministry of Science and Higher Education, and Poland, in Poland, and European Association for Jewish Studies. The conference was made possible thanks to the support of the Taube philanthropists, the William Key Bowes Junior Foundation and Association of the Jewish Historical Institute of Poland. The project is a part of commemoration of the centennial of the regaining of independence. And the conference is organized under the patronage of the Polish Society for Jewish Studies. We have two speeches in this opening part, and it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Dariusz Stola, who is director of the Polin Museum of the History of Polish Jews.
Good morning. Welcome to the Museum of the History of Polish Jews. Most of you I welcome not for the first time. I'm very glad that we can contribute to the celebrations of the centennial of Poland's independence with this academic conference. The new independent Poland, and 100 years ago it wasn't clear if independent Poland will eventually emerge and what shape it will take. Brought, as we show it in our core exhibition, brought initially quite an ambiguous message. On the one hand, it was built since the beginning of a very modern state, modern and democratic republic. So, for example, it was yesterday that we celebrated the centennial of equal rights of female voters. Poland was to be a democratic country not only for male citizens of it, but also for female, including female and Jewish voters, which was quite a novelty, especially in the major part of Russian part of Poland up to 1914. On the other hand, and those of you who have seen our core exhibition, right in front of the pictures of the electoral posters showing this revolutionary political changes in the former Russian lands, we see the photographs of a series of pogroms that took place in the fall of 1918 and then followed in 1919, especially the dramatic pogrom in Lviv, related to the Polish-Ukrainian struggle for the city. So it was far from clear what kind of Poland there will emerge. It was kind of clear what kind of political order will emerge instead of the big multinational empires of Habsburg, Hohenzollerns, and Romanovs. And this conference is to bring the most recent scholarship on the topic, discuss new perspectives about it, and also discuss the contribution of Polish Jews to the Polish independence movement, because some of Polish Jews, and again we showed them in our core exhibition, had a significant contribution to this newly regained independence. I'm very pleased to welcome our distinguished guest, Ambassador of Israel, Mrs. Anna Azari. Welcome, Mrs. Ambassador. I'm seeing Ambassador Azari almost every day. Yesterday we had a beautiful and moving ceremony of awarding the medals of the righteous among the nations here in the next room. So I'm very glad that you're a frequent visitor to our museum. I'm very glad to see a representative of the Lithuanian embassy, Mr. Valionis, Mr. Arturas Valionis. Welcome, Mr. Valionis. We have a representative of the Minister of Science and Higher Education, Mrs. Magdalena Andrzejewska-Bem. Welcome to the museum. And Mrs. Marzena Zawanowska, who is the member of the Executive Committee of the European Association for Jewish Studies. And I'm glad that we have some of the representatives of our donors, especially Mr. Wojciech Łygaś, the representative of the Nissenbaum Family Foundation. I'm not going to take more of your time. We have quite a intense schedule for today and for most of tomorrow. So I wish all of you fruitful discussion, and I hope we will bring to light some new facts or new perspectives on the history, which is the topic of our conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It is my great honor to introduce Her Excellency Anna Azari, the Ambassador of the State of Israel.
Looking at the name of this conference, I think that on the date, which is 29th of November, we could have had a nice conference about non-Jews and the independence of Israel, because 29th of November was the UN decision about the creation of two states in Palestine, one of which wasn't created yet, but which was the base for the creation of the State of Israel. Now, it's sad for me that I can't stay here, because it's actually very, very interesting to listen to this subject matter. But when I studied history many years ago, before entering the diplomacy, but as diplomats we don't have time to continue our studies. You know what's the difference between an expert and a diplomat. Expert knows everything about nothing, and the diplomat knows nothing about everything. So I'm a diplomat. But now we will put the jokes aside, and I think that well, experiencing a very fascinating year here. For me, as ambassador of Israel in Poland, I think that the importance of historians writing history, and I stress historians writing history and not anyone else, is very visible when you follow the developments which we were involved in since the end of January this year, and then several months into this year. And it's very important to. I want to thank everybody who supports historical research, and everybody, if there are people who representatives of donors for such conferences, how important it is to have free professional academic discussions. So what I want to wish you is 2 productive and interesting days, and to excuse myself for not listening to the result. Maybe I'll read something later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that we can start our conference, which is organized by POLIN Museum and Institute of History, University of Warsaw. And we have first part of this conference, Roundtable, chaired by Maciej Zakrocki, who is an author and co-author of hundreds of TV and radio series and documentaries dedicated to history, mostly of the 20th century. Maciej, the floor is yours.
But not to make a noise, I'm asking you, the panelists, to join me. We have a round table which is not round. Thank you, Artur, to invite me to this conference and to this project. I'm honored to be here, but it means that I have a stage fright standing in front of such a demanding audience, because as a TV and radio journalist, I used to produce many documentaries, but they had mostly an easy and sometimes even entertaining form, but never I was doing anything dedicated to scientists and professional historians, so I'm asking you to be indulgent. We start the conference with a roundtable entitled Polish Independence, Jewish Question and Neighbors. This is a very complicated story in extremely complicated times. So many nations felt that the time had come to fight for the independence and for reconstruction or construction of dreamed state. And the process was strictly connected with growing nationalism and growing fear of those who could not have on the land of their ancestors own independent state. Millions of Jews in Central and Eastern Europe asked many questions at the time. What kind of conditions a new country would offer us? On whose side to stand? Here we have an interesting case, in my opinion, in Lithuania, and I hope that we will describe it. Will we be able to enjoy together with Poles, Czechs, Lithuanians, that they have the independent states? Should, or at least can we demand so-called non-territorial autonomy? To what extent? What does it mean in practice? Rights of minorities, religious and cultural freedom, nationality and citizenship? This list of the questions is really long, and I hope that some of them will be asked during our discussion. Let me introduce the guests. Darius Staliunas. This is the good pronunciation? Staliunas? Yeah. Okay. Is Deputy Director of the Lithuanian Institute of History, editor of Lithuanian Studies series at Academic Studies Press. I think everybody has the conference papers, so more about every panelist you can find there. Stefan Stach, a historian at the Institute of Modern History, Czech Academy of Sciences. His academic interests include Polish-Jewish relations in the 20th century. Hello.
Hello, thank you.
Christhard Henschel works at the German Historical Institute in Warsaw. His research interests include Polish history in the 19th and 20th centuries and Jews in Eastern Central Europe. Hello, happy that you are with us. Andrzej Zamoyski, historian, a visiting researcher at the Friedrich Meinecke Institute, Freie Universität Berlin. Hello. And what I said, all the publications of our distinguished panelists you can find in the conference papers. Can we start with a short question and with the short answers, please? How much, in your opinion, the Jewish issue was important, seriously discussed in the end of the First World War among the greatest politicians of that time, inside the Jewish communities? Was it really a serious problem, or everybody was just focused on how to build or re-establish the independent countries? Who wants, please? I'm not...
Since I'm kind of representing the smallest nation or smallest state, I could start. Yeah, maybe I should start with a remark that it's really very difficult to talk about these issues in this professional audience. So I think that many things that we are going to tell you, you know better than those of us who are sitting behind this table. With regards to Lithuania, I would say that the Jewish issue, of course, was not the first priority for any national group or leaders of national group. It was always a secondary, and it was, I would say, instrumental especially for Lithuanian political elite. But maybe we'll go into specifics later on. And with regard to Jews, I also would stress at the very beginning that I think we will be going to talk about a very small minority and their perceptions, their visions, and their loyalties. Because for the majority of Jews, at least it seems to me, these questions of political loyalties were not the question they thought on everyday basis. And the majority of them were, I would say, nationally indifferent.
I can say that, yeah, we talk about 1918 is one of the crucial years in the history of Eastern Europe, especially in the eastern neighbors of Poland. We see that continuation of the Great War, and when in Western Europe, war stopped in November 1918, in Eastern Europe, we see the change, the chain of military conflicts, or so-called wars, and after the Great War. In this period, collapse of several empires, German, Austro-Hungarian, and Russian. In the former Russian Empire, we see that the period when the Bolsheviks took power and promote their certain projects, especially project of nationalities, and Jewish question was very important in this project.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I think this question is not so easy to answer. If you look at the international politics, so I'm not the expert, there are other people in the room who could answer this question better, but maybe we can see that, maybe we should remember that in 1918, Eastern and Central Eastern Europe was under the German rule until November, and I think the Western allies that their focus was not so much the so-called Jewish questions, because they concentrated on the building of a new order in the eastern part, and Jews were not in their focus. And I think that discussions in Versailles, they just brought up this the subject more. But if you look at the Polish context, I think these discussions, they did not only pop up in 1918, but they were much older. We can see discussions about the place or the integration or not integration of Jews in the Polish state. We can see during the whole 19th century, and this is a very important context for the discussions of the year 1918, I think.
Mm-hmm. Stefan Stark?
Yeah, maybe I would add that, of course, those people who were building new states were, first of all, dealing with practical questions: how to build with states, how to gain recognition of independence, how to secure independence by military means. But on the other hand, I mean, these states which were built had a certain proportion, and especially in the Polish case, it was not such a small proportion of Jewish citizens, if they would be independent. So I would say the question might have been ignored by many people, by many politicians of these national movements for a certain time, but it popped up by itself because there was the Jews who were actors themselves in these debates. They made clear that they are there and they expect certain rights. They expect some demanded autonomy, others demanded religious freedoms, and so I think the question if these politicians dealt with it or not might also be maybe a little bit the wrong question, because of course this question what to do with Jews had to be answered, and it had to be answered at best in dialogue with the Jewish communities, which happened in some states of the region. For example, in Czechoslovakia, at least if we compare it to the other states, where the Jewish representatives of the Bohemian lands met, for instance, with Beneš and also with Masaryk, even before independence was declared. Mm-hmm. And in other states it did not happen so much. And the other aspect I would like to draw to is that during the occupation, the German occupation of the East Central Europe, especially the Jewish communities gained much of independence and self-determination under German occupation, which made themselves during this time much more self-confident than they might have been before the First World War.
Mm-hmm. Darius Stalinas mentioned the term political loyalties. And I think it's good to talk a little bit about this issue, because it's underlined by many historians that the First World War was kind of a turning point in the Jewish history, because there was a problem of so-called divided loyalties. How to deal with the countries in which they lived and which led the war, and how to themselves, their communities, to their interest. And I think it's a good example, and I would like to ask Christhard Henschel. We know that more than 600 Jews were in the famous Józef Piłsudski legions. They were fighting, dying. They were awarded with the Cross of Independence. But can you say that they were fighting for Poland, or they were fighting for themselves, or for their rights after the Poland was established? What is your opinion?
First of all, I would like to underline that this question of loyalties, or loyalty and loyalties, is not only an issue in Polish-Jewish relations. I think the question of loyalty is a central term in this during these times. And if you look, for example, only on the question of the loyalty of the Polish rural population, how they behaved during the First World War and afterwards, so we can. This discussion has many aspects, and the problem is maybe that in the context of Polish-Jewish relation, this question of loyalty became a very strong argument in political conflict. And the link between military and loyalty is kind of natural, because if somebody is a soldier in an army, this person has to develop a kind of loyalty, of course. And this question was discussed not only in the Polish case, but also, for example, in Germany during the First World War. And so the Polish case is not that exotic that it might seem to us today. And the Jews who decided to take part in the struggle, for example, of the legions, for them it was, of course, not only a decision to fight for the independence of the Polish state, but of course they hoped to gain to gain civil rights and to be accepted by the Polish society as a part of the nation. So this link between military service and belonging to the nation was very strong, because the military was seen as one of the central institutions of a national state since the 19th century, and that's why these discussions between Poles and Jews about independence and about the nation state and about loyalties after 1918 to a great extent was concentrated in this field of military. If you look, for example, into the history of the Polish-Soviet War, I think there will be a paper about the Jabłona camp. So there are many situations where this topic was brought up again.
Just giving to voice and some figures: 500,000 of Jews serve in the Russian army. 200. Yes, 200. I mean, it's another issue because this is the 250,000 Jewish soldiers when the Americans joined the war, but this is something different. On the side of the Central Powers, 100,000 Jews serve in the German army. Austro-Hungarian army, 275,000. So it's quite a big number. Yeah.
I just wanted to add maybe to this question of loyalty, and especially to the question of allegiance. I mean, if you look at the people who were actually part of the legions, and I would like to take, for instance, the case of Jakub Szacki, who served in the legions when joined the Polish foreign ministry after independence. He was, for him, for example, and I would say for most of the Jews who were in the legions, it was not a conflict to be a Jew and a Pole at the same time. I mean, they fought for an independent Polish state. They considered themselves as Poles, as Jews, as Polish Jews who were supposed to have a right to be citizen of the state. And I mean, the Szacki case is especially an example to show how this conflict to decide between the nationalities forced upon them from outside became very tragic, because Szacki, as employee of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, he researched the pogroms in Vilna in 1920, and he reported about the pogroms and about the Polish army's role during these pogroms, and finally he quitted his service in the foreign ministry because he was deeply sad about the fact that the Polish authorities did not react to his report, because then he felt that he was not like he saw this conflict, that he could be a Pole for the Polish state, but he would not be accepted defending the interests of the Polish Jews within the state. So, so we should, I think, reconsider such one-dimensional national identities like Poles or Jews. Or for many people, it was not so clear how they would describe themselves, or it was not, at least not a situation that they would say, I'm either Pole or Jew, but they were mixed identities.
Andrei?
I would like to add that it's rather difficult to talk about. It's rather difficult to talk about loyalties, especially political loyalty, in the region of Eastern Europe, which divided with front lines. When for certain periods there is a political vacuum, when different armies, German or Polish armies, retreated, and different states or even puppy states, they had certain claim for certain territories. For example, a small shtetl in the Polish, Belarusian, Ukrainian borderland. Several authorities pretend to have this territory. So for Jews, very often it was very dangerous to demonstrate their loyalty. For example, Jewish Polish-Soviet war. If yesterday you demonstrate that you collaborate with Polish state, tomorrow revolutionary soldiers will come to arrest you, or you will have some problems. And regarding the topic of Jews in the Russian army, it was very interesting that Jews were mobilized to the ranks of Russian imperial army the response was a great scale of desertion. But when, after the February Revolution in March 1917, Jews received civil rights, we can see that a lot of young Jewish students would like to join military schools in Russian Republic. So they became loyal for this state, which granted them civil rights. And some of them struggle, even on this most majority struggle on the side of the Red Army, but certain parts, several individuals struggle on the side of white armies.
Okay, I would like to react to what my colleague said and maybe add something else. Just to start with mixed identities, the term was used a couple of minutes ago. I would call it hybrid identities, but in Lithuanian case, that was not a problem because the acculturation of Jewish population into Lithuanian society was non-existent until 1919. For understandable reasons, there is no need to talk about it in this audience. And there were also some hundreds of volunteers that were fighting for in Lithuanian army for Lithuanian independence, but actually there is no research up until now on their motivation. There are some memoirs published by these Jewish soldiers, but they were usually published in the interwar period by Lithuanian publications. So of course the motivation that is presented in these memoirs are very patriotic. Yeah, because otherwise they would be not published. So actually we don't know about their motivation, why they joined Lithuanian army. For pragmatic reasons, it was just that they had nothing to do or something else, or maybe for money. But I think we jumped a little bit to 1918 and forgot about 1914, because when the war started, there were no I mean, the Polish army was just in the formation, so the question was about loyalties to the empires that were fighting. And here there is one very important tension, I think, within the Jewish community, because as we all know, by the beginning of the war, the community that lived in the Tsarist empire became Russian Jews. I mean, they were identifying with Russia as political entity, but at the same time, they were, as late John Clear called it, not Kaisertreu. And we know the reasons why they were not loyal to Russian imperial government. So on the one hand, they were Russian Jews, but on the other hand, and at the same time, maybe the most imperial nation after Russians. But then those who fought in political terms, they were very anti-Tsarist and anti-Russian.
So very briefly, and how much the Russian Bolshevik Revolution and I don't know how common knowledge that many of the Jews were supported this Bolshevik revolution because of the fact that many of Jewish people were in this authorities, let's say, of the revolutionary Russia. Similar cases in Hungary when the leader of the revolution is also Jewish. So how this question of loyalty to the new appearing countries and to be pro-Bolshevik or anti-Bolshevik was important in that discussion. Andrei?
It's a rather interesting question. So here we can see the different sorts of mythology. That, frankly speaking, Bolsheviks, which managed to obtain the power in the vast territories of the former Russian Empire, they had approximately several thousands of members. So it's a question how this small group, political group, managed to receive power on the territory of Russia and periphery as well. In this case, we see that in the Eastern Europe, front, Western Russian front, played a crucial role. It was radicalized, and the tactic of Bolsheviks was to destroy army. So the role of Soviets on the front, the massive desertion of radicalized Russian soldiers who moved to their internal provinces was this crucial element which made this revolution on the periphery. Talking about the great percent of Jews in the ruling elites of new established Soviet states, we see that here we deal with propaganda from both sides. From one side, Bolsheviks declared that they granted equal rights to Jews as a oppressed population, oppressed people during the Russian Empire. From the other side, we see that anti-Soviet forces, political enemies and political opponents of Bolsheviks used the rhetoric that Jews contributed a huge percent of Soviet employees. Really speaking, in the first Russian government there were several Jews, among them known Leib Bronstein or Leo Trotsky. Very important moment that Jews managed to receive different posts in state apparatus during the Bolshevik reforms. Due to sabotage, Russian clerks or Russian employees abandoned their places in ministries or in different institutions, and these places were taken by educated Jewish youth, which moved from the former Pale of Settlement to Moscow, Petrograd, and the historian Bezer from Israel brightly described this flow of Jewish youth to Petrograd in the period of Russian Civil War. And the moment that Jews supported communism was widely used by different political forces in the former Russian Empire. Among them were different white armies as well. This moment was as well in Polish propaganda. And
are you done? Or?
I think at this moment, yes.
No, I just wanted to add that, I mean, this, I would say there are two answers to this question. The first answer could be, one could say, communism was attractive to Jews who were not religious, who were not so much economically engaged as entrepreneurs, because it promised them the same, like equal rights in the communist society which was to be built in Soviet Union, which was much more than many other nation states or the Tsarist Empire had to offer. On the other hand, the answer is communism at this time was attractive for many nationalities, not only the Jews, and many nationalities were among the leaders of the Soviet Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution. Even Poles, and I just want to remind you of the a Polish nobleman who became the founder of the CK. And I think he prepared to become the chairman of the Polish Communist or Polish Soviet Republic. So I would say that the other side of this question is that it was, of course, used instrumental to foster anti-Semitism in this area, because certain political parties or politicians thought they would gain from such a propaganda.
Yeah, maybe 2 sentences to this question. I would like to draw your attention to some other aspects. Lithuania was at the time of Russian revolutions under the German occupation. So if the first revolution, the February Revolution, increased pro-Russian orientation because of the fact that discrimination was abolished, discrimination against Jews was abolished in Russia, then the Bolshevik taking power made this geopolitical orientation a little bit different and increased pro-German orientation because, yeah, as it was mentioned, many Jews were afraid of Bolshevik power.
One small remark that we are talking about proportion of national minorities in the Soviet government as well, not only Jews, Poles, the proportion of Latvians was very high. And in the former Pale of Settlement, that Jews contributed a great percent among Soviet employees. It was natural because Jews constituted a great proportion of urban settlers, from 40% to and more. Mm-hmm. It was just natural that they joined these positions in state apparat and in different institutions.
Yes. I would like to refer to Stefan. We must remember that after the First World War, there were so many demonstrations of workers, of peasants, and so on, and these ideas of communism were very popular, even in Poland, even in the Polish society. And if you look, for example, on the what happened during the Polish-Soviet War, when the Bolsheviks established the local revolutionary committees, who had to kind of administrate this, there was a kind of local administration. Even Poles who were part of the National Democratic Party, or they sympathized with them, there were cases of such persons who took part and collaborated with the Bolsheviks. So I think these divisions were not so clear between Poles who are anti-Bolshevik and Jews and the so-called Żydo-Komuna, this kind of stereotype established in this time. But the consequences were very big because this discussion became very central in the summer of 1920 during the war.
Mm-hmm. I think it's time to move to another topic, and the question: which country appearing or establishing it's ready to offer more or better conditions for the Jewish people? Because we see the difference. Serious difference, at least between Poland and, let's say, Lithuania or Czechoslovakia. But I would like to ask you whether it's just, I mean, the question of a big or small heart, that we had small hearts and wanted to give less, and the Czechoslovakian or Czechoslovaks, Lithuanian, they had a bigger hearts and wanted to give more, or it was just, I would say, business, because these smaller countries appearing not, I mean, constructed or not reconstructed like Poland, they wanted to use Jewish community and the influence in the world for their purposes. Stefan, Czechoslovakia.
Well, in the Czechoslovak case, I would say it was not. I mean, if you look at the two most important statesmen of the interwar period and the period of Czechoslovak independence, it's G.G. Masaryk and it's Beneš, and neither of them was anti-Semitic. They all talked with Jews. Masaryk was adored by many Czechoslovak Jews because he engaged in 1899-19 in a process, and he defended a Czech Jew who was accused of ritual murder, and then Masaryk had surely not planned that he will become the future president of Czechoslovakia. So he had very good relations with the Jewish community in Czechoslovakia because he treated them as equal citizens of the territory. and that is, I would say, the other side of the medal if it comes to loyalty. It's not so much a question how much a state would give to the Jews or not. I mean, it's the question if you expect the citizens of Jewish descent or the Jews or however you call them to be loyal towards the state should also be loyal towards their citizens. And if Jews were able to gain a position in the civil service of a state, if he does not feel discriminated against because he's not allowed to open his shop on a Sunday, or because he's forced to work on Sabbath or whatever, he will become a more loyal citizen than some citizen who feels discriminated against. And that is something I would say that at least parts of the Polish national movement, especially during the negotiations in Versailles, but also later, did not understand that it's not about giving more or less to the Jews, but accepting the Jews as a part of the, at least in a Republican sense, understood nation.
But there was no, I repeat, any political business, because when you look even to the Paris conference or Versailles conference, there is a strong representation of Jews around the world, also from the United States, and it could be kind of thinking that having them on our side will be easier to achieve our goals as a new independent state.
Well, but again, there is the question: what means having them? I mean, if you accept Jews as a part,
I'm provoking.
Of course, but if you accept Jews as citizens, as equal citizens in a state, you would not have a problem in having them, because that is, I mean, if you look at the Versailles Treaty and about the negotiations around it, those supposedly powerful Jewish lobby there was mainly made of American, French, and British Jewry, who never demanded an autonomy for Jews in Eastern Europe. They just demanded equal rights. And if you look at the way how Czechoslovak government negotiated in Paris, there was no special Jewish articles in the minority treaty the Czech Republic or the Czechoslovak Republic signed in Paris, but it was in the case of Poland, because the Czechoslovak government could argue convincingly that they would, of course, respect the Jews as equal citizens.
And how is in Lithuania? Because it's a little bit different than Czechoslovakia situation. Poland has a lot of interest in Lithuania. We know very well what kind of interest. The new Lithuania also would like to have the independent states, and is the Lithuanian politicians fighting for the independence, I would say, using Jewish question in the struggle with Poland and also to struggle for their own independence?
Yeah, of course, but maybe I will first react to your question when you mentioned that Poland was trying to reconstruct a state while Czechs and Slovaks and Lithuanians were trying to construct a new state. So it's very important to stress that in the understanding of Lithuanian intelligentsia, they were reconstructing state. And that was not only important in claiming the right for independence, but it also created a problem. The problem that is well known in this audience, and the name of the problem is Vilnius, where Lithuanians made just 2% of the total population. So how you could claim Vilnius? Okay, you can claim it on the historical rights, but then in practical terms, you need allies. And there were not so many available. Because Poles claimed that it's part of Poland. For Russians, it was part of Russia. And Belarusians started to claim that it's also part of ethnographic Belarus. So the only group available, the group that had no idea about their own national territory in this region, were Jews. But then, of course, the problem was that Lithuanians, like all other national movements, were trying to create a nation state. And while Jews were arguing that the state that should be established, okay, with the same name, Lithuania, I'm not going now into details, but the state with the name Lithuania should be a different one. The state where to use the contemporary terminology, we can say a state of a civic nation. So all nationalities should be equal. And that problem was making tensions and was very difficult to solve, but maybe we'll discuss it later.
But if you don't mind, I will a little bit follow to describe this, what I'm naming as a business or political business, because there is a kind of competition, and I think, and the Lithuanian is trying to take advantage, and they in December 1918 organized in Vilnius Zionist conference, and they announced that they are happy to see the Lithuania as a free and democratic state based on the equal rights for everybody. Two Zionists, Jakov Vygotsky and Szymon Rosenbaum, they are entering into the Lithuanian government. So it looks that the offer is really serious.
Okay, I have to correct you a little bit. The conference was organized by Zionists themselves. And here there is an interesting situation in a scholarship, because as I mentioned, Lithuanians were claiming that they are building a nation state, while Jews were demanding for a state of let's call it nationalities. So a kind of a civic nation. And then in December 1918, Zionists who met in Vilnius decided that they are ready to join Lithuanian Council established in September 1917. So part of historical scholarship claims that Lithuanians changed their concept because before that they accepted Belarusians into the council, and now they're accepting Jews. So the state that will be created would be a civic state based on a concept of civic nation, where all nationalities have the same rights. There are many state languages, etc. So while another part of scholarship claims that Zionists accepted Lithuanian terms by joining Lithuanian Council. In my understanding, what actually happened, that it was a very pragmatic decision from both sides to join efforts, because both sides were in a very difficult situation, because Germans were withdrawing and Germans were supporting Lithuanians. They were also supporting partly Zionists, and there was a menace from the side of Bolsheviks. There was a danger that Poland will come with its army. So Lithuanians and Zionists were in very difficult situation, and so there was a decision to join together and to try to create a state. But by Zionists joining Lithuanian Council, both sides state kept to their own concept of what the state should look like. So this was, as I called it earlier, a very pragmatic alliance. Although there was some basis for this, a tradition of cooperation, etc.
I'm sorry, but just to put the point, as we say, up over the I, the Jewish living in territorial Lithuania, they wanted or preferred to be in the Lithuanian state or Polish state?
we don't know about the majority. For sure, many of them would, maybe the largest group would prefer to stay in Russia, not at Tsarist Russia, but a different Russia. But answering to your question, there were no discussions about being part of Poland until I don't know, 1919 or 1920, because maybe because of two reasons. One was that anti-Semitism was much stronger in Poland than in Lithuania. I mean, anti-Semitism was quite strong in Lithuanian national movement until 1905 revolution, but when Lithuanian national movement started to formulate political program, they understood that they need allies, and so the anti-Semitic rhetoric decreased sharply after 1905. While we know very well that in Poland, anti-Semitic rhetoric increased after 1905, and especially after 1912. So Jews who knew anything about these tendencies, of course, preferred the Lithuanian concept or Lithuanian state and not the Polish one. But then there were also some pragmatic calculations because in Poland, Jews would make a very small minority compared to the titular nation. While in Lithuania, they might have hoped to be on equal terms because in Lithuania that they were preferring, they imagined that there will be not the one dominant nationality, but many nationalities who would have more or less similar influence. Besides Lithuanians, there would be also a huge Belarusian group, and then a Jewish one and a Polish one. So there will be a possibility to negotiate better terms for Jewish autonomy or Jewish rights in these states. So actually there was no real alternative for them. They preferred Lithuania, but what was stressed many times in a scholarship, not the kind of Lithuania that Lithuanians were creating.
I just wanted to add one thing to this Vilna case, because from my own studies, I know that when Vilna was in 1819 under the civil administration of the Polish, like the civil administration of the Eastern Territories, there was a Jewish civil servant there who was coming originally from Częstochowa, and he studied for the Polish administration. He studied the Jewish community in Vilna, and he wrote a long memorandum on it, and he stated there many things, and he said, well, for the Jews of Vilna, they don't identify themselves with Poland, but he urged the Polish authorities to offer something to them, to talk with them, to convince them that their place in Poland would be a good place for them. And I mean, there were arguments which were rather pro-Polish, like, for instance, the larger market. If we consider that many important persons in the Jewish community were engaged in trade. But nothing like this happened. The Polish authorities, to a large degree, just ignored the Jews in Vilnius, while the Lithuanian politicians, as I understood, were more open to approach the Jewish community.
Mm-hmm. You want to add?
Yeah, I forgot one of a very important aspect. There were, of course, some regional differences in the attitudes of Jews towards cooperation with Lithuanians. Starting from the elections to the first Russian parliament, Duma, there was a tradition of cooperation between Lithuanians and Jews. And then the Kaunas province was a province with where Lithuanians dominating, making, if I remember correctly, about 80% of the total population. So Jews from this province were more eager to cooperate with Lithuanians than, for example, Jews from other provinces of former Grand Duchy of Lithuania.
So now it's good to move to Polish offer. Poland as a whole, not only in this part. When you try to compare from your scientific point of view, and you are not Poles, so it's easier for you to tell it. What was this Polish offer, and why it was not so maybe attractive, like Czechoslovakian, for example, in your opinion?
I can say that regarding eastern neighbors of Poland, the case of Ukraine and case of Belarus, we see that from the first partitions of Rzeczpospolita Dawnia, or Old Polish Republic, majority of Jews, especially in present-day central and eastern region of present-day Belarus, they consider themselves as Russian Jews. And for them, as Professor Staliunas has already mentioned, to be a part of Russian Democratic Republic were most preferable. For example, when in 1918, under the German occupation, Belarusian People's Republic established by a group of Belarusian national-oriented intelligentsia, Jewish community in Minsk and other cities, practically did not support this prototype of the state. It was just only beginning of national building, national state, and for local Jews, next years demonstrated that economically and as for Jews as for part of bigger Jewish community with religion, with tradition, it's better to stay in the Polish state than in Soviet Russia, because when Soviet authorities came to these territories, they abandoned religious institutions and political parties. Only several parties were allowed to exist, but until the beginning of 20s. In this comparison, Jews in Polish enjoyed more political freedom and possibilities.
I think that in the Polish case, for many Jews, it was not really clear what the Polish independence could offer them, because we just one of us mentioned the history of the Polish-Jewish relations before this First World War, and rising anti-Semitism, especially in the Russian part and the National Democrats. And if you look at the November 1918, in the very moment when the Polish state appeared on the map, anti-Jewish violence strengthened very much. And if you have the example of the pogrom in Lviv, for example, and there were many places where pogroms took place. So even in the very first moment, on the one hand, you had this very strong feeling of a threat. On the other hand, you had this young state, democratic state, which offered some kind of political rights and so on. But I think there was not enough time for Jews living on the Polish lands to develop a kind of more positive image or a positive relation to the state, because these political conflicts they went on, and if you look at the election of Narutowicz and so on, so this it was very hard for many Jews to find positive points in this Polish state, and I think this is the case in Poland, and yes, and the pre-war conflicts and the conflicts the conflicts during the war, they were continued after the war, and so we have many different experiences, and yes, that's.
So maybe it's a good moment to mention something which is called in the history like Little Treaty of Versailles, of Polish Minority Treaty, another name of it. Does it mean that this kind of document was signed? Was the situation and reasons you described that it was difficult and it was necessary to, let's say, put it in some legal frames, these relations between the new country and the Jewish community?
I mean, maybe one could look at it from two sides. On the other hand, it was important for minorities to have this treaty because it forced the states, not only Poland but other states as well, to negotiate the everyday life and the political life with the minorities. But on the other hand, it was seen by many politics as a kind of a dictate, because countries like France or Western European countries, they did not sign this minority treaty. So on the one hand, it guaranteed right to the minorities. On the other hand, the politicians of the titular nations, they felt somehow forced by other countries how they should construct their own states. So it was a reason of conflict as well in these discussions.
Mm-hmm. So, but do you think that it seriously changed the situation? Because there are a lot of comments that even if the Polish government decided to, or was forced, some people said, to sign this treaty. But what was the reality?
Yes, of course, it changed. I think it changed the politics in a way that the minorities were automatically a part of the discussion in Poland as well. But reality, of course, during the first years was different, because we have to remember that Poland was not clear in which borders Poland would exist, and we have a situation of war. And yes, so it is important to look on a concrete context where these subjects were discussed.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I mean, I would say the like several things. One thing is that, of course, the debate about the minorities treaty was very much, well, it was debated very much on the Jewish case, but it did not, of course, only affect the Jews in Poland. It affected the Ukrainians, the Belarusians, and especially the Germans who had who could not accept, to a large part, the independence of Poland, or the loss of, for example, the Posen territories or Pomeria or parts of Silesia. So while they did not pop up so much in the debate around this treaty, of course, also for the Western allies, for the League of Nations, which was not yet there at the moment when the treaty was signed, also their situation in this new country played an important role when they decided to force this minority treaty up on independent Poland, which is a point that David Engel, who is with us, made very clear in his research. So I think the fact that the debate was mainly around the Jews in this minority treaty somehow leads to a situation that it is identified only with Jewish issues, which it isn't. Mm-hmm. And on the other hand, I mean, the effect of this minority treaty, like the real effect for the Jews, I would say, is often overestimated, because the League of Nations was there, but it did not work too good as a referee who would decide who's right, the Polish state or the minority who files a complaint. I mean, in many cases, these complaints did not really really help so much to solve the situation. And if we look at the situation in the Polish state, there was hardly any Jew to be found in the civil service of Poland in the 20s and even less in the 30s, and many other discrimination which were not written in law but which factually happened took place in Poland despite the minority treaty.
So let's say a few words about the Jewish demands at this moment, because it's also the question whether they demanded too much, which couldn't be acceptable by Polish government and other governments. I think that it's good to mention this term non-territorial autonomy, because in many political discussions it was just too much to accept.
Yeah, I mean, but it was nothing which was written in the treaty. I mean, the Jews in East Central Europe and especially in Poland, they demanded autonomy, but connected to this demand there were several problems. First of all, there was no one Jewish representative body who would represent all the Jews in Poland. But there were different parties, factions, and whatever, and they all had their own idea of what this autonomy could be. So it was hard to explain to both to the Poles and to the Polish government and to the great powers in Paris what it would actually mean. This is one point. The other point is that during these Versailles conferences, not even the Jewish office, like the Jewish organizations of France, of the United States, who lobbied and who supported the Jewish rights, or the rights of the Jews, they did not ask for autonomy there, they asked for equal rights. And the whole debate about Jewish autonomy was something which took place in Poland, which was demanded by the committees from Eastern Europe, East Central Europe. They demanded autonomy to be written into these treaties, but it was not there.
Mm-hmm. Anybody wants to add something? So I think it's time to for the questions from the audience. I know that it's always difficult to find the first person. It's not difficult here. Okay, super.
Anthony is with us.
I'd like to ask about the Polish-Soviet War, which seems to me to be the key issue in this period of 1918 to 21. And obviously at one level, is this working? No. Yeah. And obviously the impact of the Polish-Soviet War on Polish-Jewish relations was largely negative because of the whole stereotype of Żydokomuna, and we're also going to be hearing about Jablonna. But I'd like to ask in more detail about what we are told to avoid counterfactual history. But there is this question, could this war have been avoided? What was actually happening at Mikasiewicz? And what were the divisions in Polish political life on the question of federalism, in quotation marks, and Eastern expansion? Was Poland, as Pilsudski said, condemned to greatness? Or was this actually a disastrous conflict which had very negative consequences, both in the short term and particularly in the medium term, in that it created two enemies to the Polish state which were never actually in the long term reconciled?
Regarding the Polish-Soviet War, I would like to say that I studied this problem of the war from perspective of Jews in Belarus. So I will not talk about the political background of this war. I can say only from the perspective of small Jewish communities, small Jewish shtetls which appeared on this battlefield. And from this point of view, I think that it was very crucial for the fact that Jewish community was divided between Polish Jews and Soviet Jews or Russian Jews, because if in 1919 Jewish communities in present-day central Belarus felt themselves more safety because of the political rights, because Zionist groups existed in Minsk, Bund and different other parties. At the same time, in the Soviet Russia, the Soviet authorities struggled actively against, especially Jewish section of the Communist Party, very actively against these political opponents. So in this part of Eastern Europe, Jewish political and cultural life flourished. Really, we can see the Kulturliga in Kiev and in other cities. So summer of 1920 was a breaking point in the relations between Jews and Poles, Jews and Russians, because retreating Polish army in this part of Eastern Europe, in the territory of Central Belarus, looted and burning Jewish property. And when Red Army came to this territory, they actively declared that they came here to defend toiling people, toiling masses, or toiling Jewish families. And in this way, we can see that Soviet authorities managed to win popularity among Jewish people, and as well in the next 20s and 30s, the effects of this behavior of Polish troops or Polish soldiers in this territory of Belarus, especially in the cities of Minsk, Nesvizh, Mir, and others, were used by Soviet propaganda to demonize Polish state.
Yes, I think that this Polish-Soviet war was a very crucial point in the building of this new state, because I think this was the moment where parts of society which were very skeptic about New Poland, for example, the peasants, they became part of the Polish nation when in summer 1920 the Red Army was advancing into the direction of Warsaw. It was Vincent de Vitos who just went to the rural areas, and he convinced the peasants to fight for the Polish independence. What was not clear. On the other hand, we have this kind of discussion among the National Democrats and from Greater Poland, who were thinking about establishing their own state or kind of autonomy, because they did not really believe that it would be possible to fight the Red Army. And so this is a very important point in this process of building the state. And again, this question of loyalties, not only of Jews, is crucial in this discussion. And to the question if it would be possible to avoid this war, I'm not really sure, because if we look at the situation in this part of Europe after the German defeat, there was a kind of vacuum, and all these new states, they popped up in this situation where Germans retreated, and it was not really clear how the communist Russia would behave. Would they try to conquer this former Russian territory again or not? And so I'm not really sure. And of course, we know Piłsudski's concept of being the first there and just to set new facts. And yes, but it's an open question. But I think at the conflicts, military conflict between Russia, Soviet Russia, and the other states was not avoidable.
Yeah, maybe considering the question of the war and the peace negotiations, I mean, and Poland damned to greatness. I mean, there was this saying that Pilsudski won the war and lost the peace negotiations, because, of course, with his idea, or the idea ascribed to Pilsudski of this confederation, which would also have the Ukrainians and the nations of the former Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth into one confederation, would have been a construction which probably would have served many Jews much better than a Polish nation state, because it was per se multi-ethnic and multinational. But that was precisely the reason why the National Democrats on the Riga Peace Treaty prevented too much territorial gain for Poland in the east, because they did not want to have a state which is not dominated by the Poles. And so I would say the one problem, especially for the Jews, and many of the Jews in Pilsudski's camp supported this confederational ideas or federation ideas, was that also the Polish national movement was not clear about which Poland they want to establish after the First World War.
Następne pytanie. I would like to remind you that we also can speak in Polish, so if somebody feels shame a little bit to ask the question in Polish, don't be, because we have a translation, so don't worry.
I wanted to ask about for your comments about the little bit deeper historical context, means of...
Because we have a translation, so please use the mic.
Okay, yeah. Sorry, I wanted to ask about the deeper historical context, meaning the beginnings of the democracy in a in European semi-periphery. Election of 1906, 1907, 1912, and 1916, mass politics, democratization, and the rise of ethnic conflict, as a context for a problem as a context for a Jewish problem in 1918. About the deeper, consequences of the birth of the mass politics before, and how much it translates into the deeper problem during the independence of Poland.
Okay. I will try to answer. I'm not an expert, but I will. I will try. I think this 1905 changes and in the years after. I think you answered your questions by yourself, because of course it's a very important context, and of course we can observe this. The rise of national ideas. We can observe the rise of professionalization of politics in several fields, and but I think not only this. Yes, and we can observe these processes in every part of the Polish of partition Poland. That Poles and other nations they want to get part of the political discussions and the political practices of these countries. And I think these experiences were very important for the politicians who later built the new republic, because part of them they just learned how to act as politicians and as as politicians. Their experiences were very important to build the new state. Yeah.
Yeah. No. Go. I talked enough. So.
You kept silence too long.
No, if I understood your question correctly, then the dynamics that we have in Lithuania are very different from the ones in the Kingdom of Poland. And I mentioned it a little bit in my earlier talks, but what we have in 1918 in Vilnius, then we have a situation when some Jewish activists are saying that, look, we have to cooperate with Lithuanians because there is a long tradition of cooperation. And what they meant was an alliances made during Duma elections. In 1905, many Jewish activists were asking themselves who are Lithuanians, because the knowledge on the Jewish street about Lithuanian national movement was rather limited. And then we have a situation when they managed to make alliances during all 4 Duma elections. And what is interesting is that that alliances were made not only with Lithuanian social democrats, which was quite self-evident because there was quite a long tradition of working together starting from the late 19th century, but also, for example, during the Duma elections in 1906, the Jewish committee made an alliance with Lithuanian nationalists. The reason Lithuanian nationalists made this alliance was because they didn't want to make it with Poles. So this tradition helped a lot for negotiations in 1917 and 1918. And this one very interesting episode that took place in Petrograd in the spring or June, I forgot the exact date, or June 1917, when Lithuanian Interim Council was elected, and there was a meeting of Lithuanian Jews where they discussed whether to join this committee or not. And the majority voted to join this Lithuanian committee, but the trick is that the majority in this meeting in Petrograd were the Jews who came from the Kaunas province. And this decision was made by or initiated by the same people who were cooperating with Lithuanians in elections to Duma in Kaunas province. So this tradition was quite an important factor, not the most important, but one of more important factors that helped to find a kind of compromise in 1918.
And maybe here I would just add that there was a similar development also in Galicia, which was dominated by Polish elites, and where Jews and Ukrainians began to cooperate, especially during the elections, to gain representation, because usually the Poles would have had the relative majority in for every mandate, but once Jews and Ukrainians cooperated, and they could break the Polish dominance in at least in parts and gain representation in the political system. So this possibility to see that minorities cooperating could work and could bring representation to Jews or to other smaller minority groups was something which surely emerged before the First World War and also influenced the situation after First World War.
Okay, I see Robert Kostro, the director of the Muzeum Historii Polski.
Słychać mnie? Tak. Ja mam pytanie. Nie, chyba słychać. Ja mam pytanie dotyczące raczej tego, bo mówimy Polacy, Żydzi i tak dalej. Ja mam takie wrażenie, że ta postawa Żydów była bardzo różna w zależności i od regionu, i też od grupy społecznej i tak dalej. To by mnie bardzo ciekawiło. Znaczy mówimy tak naprawdę o kimś innym, mówiąc o inteligencji żydowskiego pochodzenia, czy żydowskiej inteligencji, która brała udział w legionach, bardzo mocno zasymilowanej, często lewicowej i tak dalej. I mówiąc równocześnie o Nie słucham. A teraz? Słucham? Lepiej, dobrze. No więc wydaje mi się, ja nie jestem specjalistą, ale wydaje mi się, że mówimy o czymś zupełnie innym, mówiąc na przykład o inteligencji żydowskiego pochodzenia, czy też żydowskiej inteligencji uczestniczącej w legionach, a czymś innym mówiąc na przykład o ortodoksyjnym sztetlu gdzieś właśnie na Białorusi. I również odnosząc się do tej kwestii wojny polsko-bolszewickiej czy polsko-sowieckiej, to też jest pytanie, na ile ten fakt tego, że ona wpłynęła bardzo mocno na zbudowanie takich stereotypów antysemickich, na ile był fakt, że ta wojna się rozgrywała właśnie tam na Kresach, tam gdzie z różnych powodów Żydzi na przykład właśnie w Wilnie czy na Ukrainie no, kalkulowali, czy część, w każdym razie duża część środowisk żydowskich kalkulowała na sojusz właśnie czy z Ukraińcami, czy z Litwinami, czy w jakimś sensie też również wspierała bolszewików, właśnie obawiając się większości Polski, niezależnie od tego, jakie były te relacje wcześniej z Litwinami czy z Ukraińcami.
To nie pytanie. To teraz można po polsku tak odpowiedzieć, czy dobrze. Oczywiście to jest ważne, żeby patrzeć, że były różne środowiska żydowskie i tak dalej, ale z drugiej strony też w percepcji, jak patrzymy na przykład na tą wojnę polsko-bolszewicką, to władze wojskowe doskonale zdają sobie sprawę z tego, że taka jest sytuacja, że są różne środowiska i że Żydzi w 90% nie wspierają, albo więcej nie wspierają właśnie bolszewików, ale z drugiej strony jest taka silna presja w prasie, gdzie po prostu ten stereotyp się powtarza i tam ci autorzy nie odróżniają Żydów właśnie według tych grup. I to stworzy taką sytuację, że ta fala antysemityzmu, która istnieje szczególnie w lecie 20 roku, tak się zasila, że wojsko, będziemy dzisiaj o tym jeszcze mieli referat, decyduje się na to internowanie Żydów w okolicach Warszawy, w Jabłonii. I my teraz oczywiście możemy patrzeć wstecz i powiedzieć tak, ale przecież były różne grupy, ale w percepcji wielu polityków i publicystów szczególnie, bo ja myślę, że wpływ publicystyki i prasy na politykę był w tym 20 roku kluczowy, był po prostu inny. I właśnie to się skończyło w Jabłonii.
Andrzej Zamojski.
No to zaczęliśmy mówić po angielsku, to powiem po angielsku. Jewish community, especially in the Polish Kresy Wschodnie, Polish Eastern borderlands was really fragmented, and we can see that in this period it was Polish-Soviet war was one of the military conflicts. And certain group of Jews were tied because practically the war in these territories was from 1914-1915, and Jews experienced so many changes and different government of different rules from Russian Empire authorities, German occupation authorities, Polish authorities, and Soviet ones. So very important factor that certain category of Jewish people consider their future with Declaration of Balfour and with Zionist movement. We can see that in a small shtetls was of big popularity were different Zionist movements. Hechalus especially, young people trained for colonization of Palestine because for them these changes, political changes in Europe demonstrated they are alien, że oni są obcy na tych terenach.
Tam pan zgłaszał?
I just want to add one short sentence concerning the question if we have to decide between the Orthodox the traditional Jews and the assimilated or acculturated Jews, I would not divide it so clearly, because I mean there were many who, yeah, I mean, because I mean, where did they come from? Even if they studied at Polish Gymnasium or at the university in Warsaw, most of them, if you look at the biographies, they came from Orthodox or from Hasidic families or from traditional, at least, families. And if they, I mean, if they joined the legions and they were fighting for Polish independence, they also fought for a state where their Orthodox relatives could live. And I mean, so this. But I mean, they did not abandon their families, I guess.
Słonimski's texts from the 1930s, he's very anti-Orthodox. He's as much.
No, but yeah, sure, but I mean, but this is also a different a different.
He was raised.
No, but I mean, it's also a difference if you consider yourself Polish or assimilated or think this is the good way for the Jews to do, but so if you are politically an opponent of Aguda Israel, for instance, or other Orthodox parties, but on the other hand, it does not mean that that these Jews wanted to kick out traditional Jews from the state or from the society. That is, I mean, that is something.
Bardzo proszę.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, since we have here the experts also on the neighbors of Poland in early independence, we have already heard in the discussion, and of course we know it also, that two crucial points have been discussed in these times, and the one was equal civil rights for Jews in their respective nation states, and the other autonomy. And I would just like to ask if whoever feels tempted, who is an expert on the neighbor states, how the issue of autonomy was discussed in those very states, or if it was an issue at all.
Yeah, it was already mentioned in this discussion, and it's well-known fact in the audience that the Jewish autonomy existed in Lithuania in the interwar period, only that in many situations I think it's depicted in a very idyllic way, because it seems that there was different approaches in the Jewish community itself, how to perceive this community. And if I remember correctly, the majority of Jews were not paying taxes for community issues that was introduced by the law. And then that personal autonomy was very short-lived in Lithuania, because due to the fact that it was implemented because of some pragmatical calculations, when these reasons disappeared, and one of the reasons was related to the Vilnius question, and after 1923 it was obvious to everyone that Jews had not helped Lithuania to save Vilnius, and then by 1922 Lithuania got the de jure how you call it, acceptance by the international community. So there were no international the reasons related to foreign policy or to the statehood that would keep this autonomy alive. And then also one more interesting fact is that in 1923 there was a census in Lithuania which showed that Jewish community made only 7% of the total population, which also diminished the demand from Lithuanian side to treat them as an important factor within Lithuania.
I mean, there existed also like on the paper at least, autonomy for Jews in several Ukrainian states, which and that was the problem, did not exist very long. So, so there was, I mean, there were, of course, some of these states were ready and able to propose autonomy to the Jews, and I mean, we do not know how a Western Ukrainian state would have looked like and what would have been the situation of the Jews there, or the situation of the Poles, who I think also had their own ministry in the government. But I mean, the other question is, what do we understand under autonomy? If we one could interpret, for example, the situation in Jewish communities in Poland in the late 20s also as partly autonomy, or at least on a very low level autonomy, because I mean they officially worked as religious communities, but de facto the people who were running for the elections of the board were political parties, members of political parties, sometimes of anti-religious parties like the Bund or Koalicja and Lewica. So. And what the community did with its funds, which they gained through the community tax, was that they funded schools or welfare, which in many cases had no relation to religious services. So one could see it as at least a very, very slight beginnings of a Jewish autonomy, which was, of course, much, much less than many Jews would have hoped for.
Yeah. Colleagues, more comments to this question?
I just only would like to say that during the Polish-Soviet War, the Bolsheviks intended to bring their Soviet Jewish project to these territories. Officially, Soviet power granted equal rights to Jews. But if we will see that from 1918, a great majority of Jews, especially in small towns, appeared as a part of category of people who were deprived of the rights, so-called lishenцы in Russian. Majority of them were from families of so-called petty bourgeoisie. And from this point, these people have no civil rights to vote and so on. Their children could not be students in higher educational institutions. And regarding Soviet model, it was a clear idea that Jews should be integrated to Soviet people, so-called, and be a part of the other Soviet nationalities, Soviet Poles, Soviet Russians, Soviet Belarusians, and so on. So they agreed to give them Yiddish as a mother tongue. Jews had this possibility to develop the network of schools and institutions within the policy of national policy of the 20s, but in the mid of 30s, everything was abandoned.
Mm-hmm. Pytanie?
It's on? Okay. I think we are assuming the actual existence of a state in November of 1918. And I would say that, states need to be built. And there is really no state in November of 1918 in Poland. What we have is the transfer of power to Józef Pilsudski and a proclamation, but this doesn't a state make. A state needs borders, it needs a government, it needs maybe a constitution, it needs an army, and none of these things really existed in November of 1918. What we have instead are a set of competing abstractions. Calling themselves Poland. And I would make an argument that a Polish state that has been built and it has form and it has, I don't know, a monopoly over legitimate violence doesn't occur until after the Polish-Soviet War. That being said, if we think of Warsaw as the center of this set of competing abstractions, then every Jewish political party that counted in Warsaw proclaimed its loyalty to the abstraction of Poland before November of 1918.
Mm-hmm. Anybody wants to comment it? Or? Okay, so let's make a little, let's say, conversation. You need mine.
There was the government, there was army. Only not all borders were clear, of course. But in January you have elections to the parliament, so you cannot make elections to the parliament without having a state. So it's not possible. So. The only thing is that in Eastern Galicia there was a war, Polish-Ukrainian war, and of course the status of Wielkopolska, Greater Poland, was not clear at that time.
Mm-hmm.
Of course the eastern parts also, Belarus, etc. But the great part of Poland was already there.
Of course, establishing a country is a process, and we absolutely confirm that it took some time. But as we have 100th anniversary of the independence, we also look at this date as a symbolic date. So let's bear in mind that this is this kind of thinking. Bardzo proszę, panie profesorze.
I have a short. It's good. A short question. What was the influence of Western powers on the Jewish question in Eastern Europe? The first part of my question, because this problem was not presented now. And the second part is, if the Jewish question in France and in Great Britain was influence on the position of Western powers in this question in Eastern Europe.
Yeah, we were talking a little bit about this little treaty of Versailles, which was as an outcome of the discussion between the Jewish representation in the Paris conference. But if, of course,
just very short answer. I would like to say that the most important was practical steps to help Jews to survive in Eastern Europe. So this support done by American Jewry and the Western European Jewry, parcels with food, so medical aid. I think it was the most important for concrete moment and for concrete people.
Mm-hmm.
I would like to add one small aspect. I think that Western powers were present in the Polish debates all the time, because if you look at the discussion at the government level, so we can observe that for Polish politicians at this time it was very, very important how the public opinion and the opinion of politicians in the Western countries, especially in France and Great Britain, how they thought about the Polish politics. And for Polish politicians during this time, it was very important to show the Western governments in Paris and in London that Poland is not an anti-Semitic state, and they tried to convince them. And so this question how the Western powers would react in Jewish questions in Poland, it was there during all these discussions we talked about today.
Mm-hmm.
May I?
Yes, sure.
All right. I have a broader question. In my understanding, we are dealing with two parallel huge phenomena. On the one hand, there is something we can call crisis of Judaism, the end of traditional Jewish life in East Central Europe. On the other hand, there is the end of the old political order in East Central Europe. The Great Pious collapsed. How these two phenomena, crisis of Judaism and a total rebuilding of Central Europe, were connected?
The crisis of Judaism was not caused by the Great War. It was the continuation of processes of modernization in this territory. But the Great War was a key event because it accelerated these processes. So especially collapse of empires and establishment of new states, and so. This political deformation of Jewish communities accelerated by the First World War.
Stefan?
Yeah, maybe. I would also say that the crisis of Judaism, I mean, it was of course the influx of modernity, which did not only attach. I mean, it did not only attach the Jews. I mean, there was a crisis in traditional Jewish religious life and the dominance in Jewish communities, but that could also be said for many other religious communities or national communities in the region. I would say that the democratization, the idea of democracy, which came into being the developments, the rise of socialist movements, for instance, which also, I mean, I wouldn't see that it was so especially Jewish, this breakaway of traditional power order. I mean.
All right, so maybe I should clarify my point a bit. I believe that the Jews faced two challenges. One challenge that a lot of them had to find a new way of life because the old way of life didn't work anymore for various reasons. And at the same time, there was a complete political restructuring of East Central Europe. And in this sense, I believe that the Jews faced double challenge because to a Polish landowners, political changes were good, but his life didn't really change so much if he survived in his estate, right? But to a big part of Jewish population, this was not only about new political loyalties and new political situation, but about their lives, how to live in this situation. And a beautiful example of this challenge would be young Jews in Hasidic dress participating in communist demonstrations, right? You have Hasids who decided that they would go with communists. So do you see here an additional complex problem? The end of the old world in terms of their everyday life, in terms of their beliefs, and a complete chaos in November 18.
I'm afraid you asked so serious question for the next panel.
This is a very serious conference.
Yes. So we can see as well that Jews had to make their choice, especially in the region we talk about, the region of Eastern Europe, different states and new approaches, new political possibilities. To be involved in different national projects, and this is interesting fact about Hasids who participated in the demonstration, because as well there were facts when after the pogroms in Ukraine, Hasids joined the ranks of Red Army. So it was a choice, but at that moment it's very difficult. People had no idea what to expect them in 10 years and 20 years. They lived in the concrete period, and there were certain hopes. There was certain hopes on equal rights in these countries, certain hopes related to migration to Palestine, and different. So it's one of the enormous, broad questions you ask us, and I think it's not so easy to answer it at once.
I mean, I would just add that, I mean, the engagement of Jews in several different national movements, the rise of Zionism, the rise of Jewish Bundism, the idea of folkism and the Jewish autonomy. I would see it all as a reaction to this situation you described. And I would also argue that, referring to the question if it affected also other parts of the population, that the actual number of Polish estate owners who could stay on their estate was not so high regarding to the rest of the Polish population of the time. I mean, and also for like peasants, the situation very much changed after Polish independence, because they could have their say in politics, for instance. And so, of course, I mean, it was a very tense situation for the Jewish communities in that reason, as it was for most of the other parts of the population. And the question the Jews had to find an answer for was to find their place in the new situation, which was especially hard as it was not yet clear what this new situation actually would look like.
If I could comment on Professor Wróbel's very important comment, that we tend to see the 19th century as a modern period, and then the crisis of Jewish tradition and the First World War as just deepening the crisis of tradition, and then the Second Republic deepening even more. But we can see also 1918 as a starting point of Jewish religious answer to the crisis of tradition, modern religious answer in the form of Orthodox. And we see on the formation of Agudat Israel how it develops on the Polish lands during the First World War. We see the establishment of network of schools for Orthodox girls based in Krakow, how it develops in inter Poland. We see the development of Hasidic yeshivot, etc., etc. We actually see that in the Second Polish Republic, Orthodox streams would find finally the modern answer for the crisis of modernity. And in that case, it's not only a crisis; it's also a chance. And the last stage of building of the very strong Orthodox community, with a very important historical postscriptum, that after the Holocaust, many of those institutions that were built in a laboratory of inter-war Polish Republic kind of retained the survival of Orthodox Jewish community. So it's another, very important internal Jewish context of the 1918, not only in Poland but in whole Central Eastern Europe.
Time is over. I know that there is the tradition to summarize or to say the final comment, but really I'm a journalist, and having so distinguished historians in front of me, I will not do this. I just wanted to thank to all the panelists. The coffee break is always a good opportunity also to continue the discussion. So if there are more questions to the panelists or just between you, please do it. So let's have some claps for the panelists, and thank you very much.